Sandra from Santa Fe asks if there is any way creative systems theory's framing of intelligence's multiplicity could help us better understand where we're at with artificial intelligence. I think very much so. I'm drawn back to some articles I wrote a few years back in response to front page news warnings of possible dangers. Machine learning should provide great benefits in times to come, but a growing number of prominent figures have highlighted potentially dire consequences. I think the risks are very real. Unless we can learn to think about possible outcomes in more sophisticated ways, some of the most intriguing innovations of our time may very well prove to be our undoing. To respond to Sandra, I'll address a couple of topics that are key if we are to avoid this result. First, I'll describe several mechanisms through which harm could occur. We can only address what we can recognize. I'll then turn to what will be necessary if major harm is to be avoided. I'll argue that the antidote to cataclysm lies ultimately in more deeply understanding the fundamental differences between artificial intelligence and human intelligence. Because the differences are so fundamental, in fact, I try to avoid using the term artificial intelligence, choosing to speak instead simply of machine intelligence or machine learning. The power of machine intelligence, for both good and ill, comes from the immense quantities of data modern computers can process, combined with the ability of machine learning algorithms to learn as they go. There are also a couple of further characteristics that directly contribute to where there are dangers. Often, human operators don't have access to the underlying learning processes with which machine learning happens, and commonly could not understand them if they did. They're just too multifaceted. And once a machine learning process starts up, it will follow the goal assigned to it unswervingly, whatever the consequences, unless specific safeguards are built into the instructions. I think of three kinds of scenarios where machine learning could have truly cataclysmic consequences. The first two we have already encountered, but at a limited scale. The last, the one that would be most difficult to combat, we have not yet faced. In the first, some kind of bad actor on the world stage wages a machine learning-based attack on a perceived enemy. The goal could be the destruction of physical infrastructure, such as electrical grids and water supplies, disruption of communication networks, or, as we have seen attempted in a very rudimentary form with Russian interference in elections, a fundamental undermining of social and governmental structures. This kind of attack would not require that the perpetrator be a developed nature. Only technical abilities that should become increasingly available would be needed. It could easily be mobilized by a rogue state such as North Korea or even a terrorist group. Once initiated, it could quickly spin out of control. We legitimately include this kind of implication when we think of weapons of mass destruction. In time, it may prove the most problematical example of such weaponry. The second scenario is less obvious in its destructiveness, but it is where currently we see the greatest harm. Increasingly today, our electronic devices are designed to capture our attention, pretty much whatever it takes to do so. And machine learning plays an increasing role in how they accomplish this. As a psychiatrist, I consider device addiction one of our time's most pressing concerns. In an earlier episode, I described how the mechanisms with the device addiction are essentially the same as those that produce the attraction of addicting drugs. Our devices create artificial stimulation that substitutes for the bodily feedback that would normally tell us that something matters. Machine learning has the potential to compound these mechanisms many times over, support the creation of ever more powerful digital designer drugs with increasingly destructive results. Machine learning's role in producing a world in which distraction and addiction more and more replace meaningful activity could very well be the way it ultimately contributes most directly to our undoing. The third kind of scenario is what people in the tech world most often point to when they warn that machine learning could be the end of us. Systems applying machine learning could very well come to outcompete us. It is easy to make the goal of a machine learning algorithm simply to have the mechanism propagate itself. Such algorithms can be single-minded in their competitiveness in a way that we humans will never be and would never want to be, in spite of how often that we think of ourselves as competitive in a simplistic Darwinian fight for survival sense. We, thankfully, are more complex than just this. People often express fear that artificial intelligence will eventually be more intelligent than we are. In limited ways, machine learning systems are already more intelligent than human systems and will only get more so. Ultimately a good thing if they're to serve us. The danger lies with the possibility of an algorithm having the single-minded goal of self-propagation, a goal that could be programmed in or be a secondary product of a kind of digital natural selection. The fact that learning in such systems can take place autonomously and is often beyond our ability to decipher, much less control, means that we face the very real risk of runaway mechanisms where the destruction of humanity, if not an outright intent, becomes an unintended consequence. These are legitimately scary possibilities. And as I've suggested, they're not just possibilities. In their beginning manifestations, they are realities we already live with. It could easily seem that there is nothing we can do. If the machines want to take over, eventually they will. This is the conclusion that many people in the tech world, aware enough to be concerned, seem to be reaching. This may well be our fate. But I also don't think it needs to be. The missing piece is a simple recognition that machine intelligence and human intelligence have very different mechanisms. In fact, they really aren't related at all. As a psychiatrist, someone who works every day with intelligence's multi-layered complexities, this conclusion is so obvious it hardly needs stating. A major part of what makes machine intelligence and human intelligence different comes back to that multiplicity. Creative systems theory describes how the kind of rational processing done by our prefrontal cortex, of which we, particularly in our time, take appropriate pride, is only one aspect of human intelligence. There's also the intelligence of emotions that organizes much in human relationship and human motivation. In addition, there is the intelligence of imagination that informs the artistic and the dreams of both waking and sleeping sort. And at an even more basic level, we have the intelligence of our bodies, manifesting not just in our erotic impulses, but in the workings of our immune systems, and even with interactions with bacteria in our guts. We can think of the mechanisms of artificial intelligence paralleling those of just one aspect of human intelligence, rational processing. And in fact, machine intelligence, even at its best, mimics rational intelligence only imperfectly. If we look closely at rationality, we see that it functions in ways that are more nuanced and layered than we tend to assume. But the analogy works fine as a point of departure for grasping the basic strengths and limitations of machine intelligence. The idea that we might have machines that can carry out many of the more rational, mechanistic tasks of cognition, and more rapidly than we can, is a great thing. But it is important to appreciate that while the rational parts of intelligence serve us powerfully, very few real-world questions can be effectively answered with rationality alone. Certain purely technical concerns can be addressed in this way, but not concerns that in any way include values or human relationships, as most any that really matter to us eventually do. Human intelligence, with its multiple aspects, is simply more complex than can be modeled with a computer. Here I mean complex in a deeper sense than just more complicated. If I were referring only to technical complexity, it would be right to claim that with time we should be able to get all the complexities nailed down. The reality is that human intelligence reflects a wholly different kind of complexity. This kind of complexity not only inherently supports life-affirming decisions, it is precisely what has made human life possible. If we miss this fundamental difference, we end up making naively misguided, perhaps ultimately suicidal decisions. I've described how we can think of our multiple intelligences as working together to support our tool-making, meaning-making natures. One critical way human intelligence is different is that it is inherently purpose-centered. When I work with someone in therapy, we don't just pursue some goal. That would make therapy a rather trivial endeavor. Instead, I help the person deeply engage the whole of their complexity. A full, purposeful, and creative life comes as a natural consequence of doing so. Of particular pertinence to the tasks ahead for the species, there's also an important sense in which human intelligence is also by its nature moral. This might seem like a radical claim, given how frequently we are not at all moral in our everyday dealings, and given how often history reveals acts of which we should not at all be proud. It might seem preposterous. But most often in our daily lives, we act with basic fairness. And if we look at history's big picture, we find humanity bringing ever greater complexity to its moral discernments. In earliest times, much that we would today consider totally unacceptable was common. For example, human sacrifice, slavery, even cannibalism. With the last century, we've seen the civil rights and women's movements, and more recently, advocacy for the rights of people with different sexual orientations. None of this is to suggest that we are always moral in our actions. Certainly we are far from it. My point is simply that there is clearly something in what it means to be human, which is allied not just with advantage, but with a larger good. And it is embedded deeply enough that we can think of the human narrative as a whole as a story of evolving moral capacity. Human intelligence, by its nature, engages us in questions of values and purpose. We are imperfect beings, but we are also, in the end, purpose-driven and moral beings. In contrast, as I've described, machine learning follows the goals it is programmed for. When it comes to addressing the dangers of potential accompany machine learning, this distinction is critical. Machine learning is a tool, and one with great potential for good. But in contrast with human intelligence, There is nothing in it that makes it inherently good. In the end, it is not really intelligence, or to the degree it is intelligent, it mimics only one very narrow and limited kind of intelligence, and even that imperfectly. So how does this relate to the possibility of using machine intelligence wisely? I've described how cultural maturity's cognitive changes allow us to both more fully step back from all of intelligence's aspects and more deeply engage and draw on the whole of intelligence's complexity. When it comes to the task of applying machine learning, this picture includes both good news and bad news. On the good news side, it means that the more complex and sophisticated kind of thinking needed to make the required discernments is not only possible, as potential, it is built into who we are. On the bad news side, if the concept of cultural maturity is not basically correct, there is little justification for hope, and we're only making first baby steps into this new, more mature territory of experience. Effectively managing machine learning and its effects will depend not just on drawing on the purpose-centered and moral nature of human intelligence, but doing so with a new kind of sophistication. We have to ask every step of the way whether a particular application ultimately benefits, in the end makes us more. We also have to be exquisitely sensitive to possible unintended consequences. It is unintended consequences rather than malevolence that will most likely be our undoing. In our time, we easily miss the critical difference between machine intelligence and human intelligence. Indeed, because we so readily idealize the technological, in effect, make it our God, we can get things totally turned around completely. Caught in techno-utopian bliss, we can make machine intelligence what we celebrate. We do so at our peril. Our well-being as a species depends on remembering that our tools are just that, tools. Our ultimate task as tool makers is to be sure that we use our ever more amazing tools, not just intelligently, but wisely. That starts with being able to distinguish between ourselves and our tools. With culturally mature perspective, we no longer confuse ourselves with our tools, and certainly we stop treating our tools as gods. This last recognition becomes particularly critical with machine intelligence. If you came upon a person who, being particularly fond of his hammer, put it up on an altar and burned incense in its honor, you might find him weird, but let it pass. If, however, the hammer the person worshipped was capable of rising up on its own, hitting the person on the head and killing him, and perhaps killing everyone else in the process, then you would appropriately consider the person dangerous and insane. That is the reality that we face today with machine intelligence. It can serve us powerfully as we go forward, but it can do so only if we are clear in our understanding of what it is and what it is not. These reflections might stretch how we usually think, but from the vantage provided by cultural maturity's cognitive changes, all this again becomes rather common sense. Again, your comments appreciated.